barely quenches my thirst. My hands haven't stopped trembling since that night in Jerusalem when Jesus took me to the edge of the abyss and showed me hell's worst torture, a revelation so devastating, so contrary to what most Christians believe, that I've been physically ill trying to process what I witnessed. What I'm about to share will destroy everything you think you know about eternal punishment. It's not the fire. It's not the darkness. It's not even the separation from God that most pastors describe. Hell's worst torture is something far more horrifying, something so psychologically devastating that when Jesus showed it to me, I collapsed and begged him to erase the memory from my mind. He refused. They need to know the truth, he told me, his eyes filled with a sorrow deeper than any ocean. You must tell them what you've seen. So here I am, finally finding the courage to describe an experience that has fundamentally altered how I understand justice, mercy, and the human soul itself. But I need to warn you, once you know what I know, you can never unknow it. This revelation will haunt you as it has haunted me. It will force you to reconsider everything you've been taught about hell. And for many, it will be the most disturbing spiritual truth you've ever encountered. It began 3 weeks ago during a private pilgrimage to Jerusalem. I'd taken a break from filming to spend time in prayer at some of Christianity's most sacred sites. After an emotionally exhausting day visiting the Via Dolorosa and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I found myself drawn to the Garden of Gethsemane as night fell over the ancient city. The garden was closed to tourists, but something compelled me to climb over the low stone wall. Perhaps it was exhaustion clouding my judgment, or perhaps it was divine orchestration, I still don't know. What I do know is that as I made my way among the ancient olive trees, some of which have stood since the time of Christ, the air around me changed. The distant sounds of Jerusalem traffic faded to absolute silence. The temperature dropped so dramatically that my breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. And then he was there, not as a gentle presence or a warm feeling in my heart, but as a physical, tangible person standing before me, his eyes holding galaxies of love and universes of sorrow simultaneously. Jesus Christ, in the flesh, in the same garden where he had once sweat drops of blood before his crucifixion. I fell to my knees, unable to stand in his presence, my entire body trembling uncontrollably. This wasn't the sanitized, gentle Jesus of children's Bible stories or popular imagination. This was the Lion of Judah, the King of Kings, radiating such authority and holiness that I could barely breathe. "Jonathan," he said, my name in his mouth sounding both like a caress and a summons, "I have chosen you to witness what few living humans have seen. Tonight I will show you the truth about hell's worst torture, not to condemn but to warn, not to terrify but to save. Are you willing?" Every instinct in my body screamed at me to refuse. Something in his voice, some terrible knowledge behind his eyes, told me that what he was offering would forever change me, and not in ways that would bring comfort. But how do you say no to God incarnate? How do you refuse the one who died for you? "Yes, Lord," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. "I am willing." He extended his hand, and as I took it, the Garden of Gethsemane dissolved around us. The ancient olive trees, the stone wall, the night sky over Jerusalem, all of it vanished in an instant. We were falling, or perhaps flying, moving at impossible speed through what felt like layers of reality itself. I could feel the dimensions peeling away around us as we descended deeper than physical space, deeper than the Earth's core, into a realm that existed somehow beneath or beyond the universe as we understand it. "What you are about to witness," Jesus said as we fell, "is not a place created for human souls. It was prepared for the devil and his angels. But those who ultimately reject my salvation choose this destination freely, though they cannot comprehend what their choice truly means until they arrive." The air grew thick and sulphurous, difficult to breathe. Darkness enveloped us, not the darkness of night, but a palpable, oppressive absence of light that seemed to consume rather than merely obscure. And then I began to hear the sounds, distant at first, then growing louder as we continued our descent. Sounds no human throat should be able to produce. Sounds of agony so profound that my mind struggled to process them. "Lord," I gasped, clinging to his hand like a drowning man to a lifeline, "I don't know if I can bear this." "You cannot," he replied simply, "not in your own strength, but I am with you, and my presence will shield you from the full impact of what we are about to witness." Without this protection, no living human could maintain sanity here. We came to rest on what appeared to be solid ground, though the surface beneath my feet felt wrong, somehow simultaneously burning hot and freezing cold, solid yet shifting like quicksand. The darkness remained absolute except for a strange, pulsing red glow on the horizon that provided just enough illumination to make the shadows more terrifying. "We are at the outer edges," Jesus explained, his voice the only source of comfort in this nightmare landscape. "What most people imagine as hell, the fire, the physical torments, exist in these regions. But this is not what I have brought you to witness. The worst torture is much deeper." He began to lead me forward, and as we walked, I could make out shapes in the darkness, human figures in various states of agony. Some were alone, isolated in their suffering. Others were grouped together, yet seemed unable to offer each other any comfort. All of them appeared to be experiencing exactly what they had most feared in life. Claustrophobics, trapped in ever-shrinking spaces. Germaphobes, covered in filth. The formerly powerful, now helpless and controlled by others. "These souls," Jesus said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "experience what many consider hell's primary torment, the perfect justice of receiving exactly what they chose through their actions and character in life. Their punishments are individually tailored to their specific sins and rejections. This is what most religious teachers describe when they speak of hell." We continued walking, passing through regions of increasing darkness and despair. I saw souls burning in lakes of fire, yet never being consumed. I saw others frozen in ice, unable to move for eternity. I saw some being torn apart by creatures I can only describe as demons, their bodies regenerating only to be torn apart again. But Jesus kept moving, leading me deeper, and I realized with growing dread that these widely imagined torments, as horrific as they were not the worst that hell contained. They were merely the outer circles of a place whose true horror lay at its center. "The physical suffering you have witnessed is real," Jesus said as we approached what appeared to be a vast cliff edge. "But it is not hell's worst torture. What lies below is what I have brought you to see, the truth that will destroy everything most people believe about eternal punishment." We stood at the edge of an abyss so deep that I could not see its bottom. Unlike the regions we had passed through, no screams rose from this darkness. Instead, there was a silence so profound it seemed to have physical weight, a silence more terrifying than all the agonized cries we had left behind. "Are you prepared?" Jesus asked, his eyes holding mine with infinite compassion. I wasn't. How could anyone be prepared for what he was about to show me? But I nodded anyway, unable to speak. Jesus raised his hand, and suddenly we were no longer standing at the edge, but floating within the abyss itself. The darkness here was different, not just an absence of light, but an absence of everything, a void so complete it seemed to negate existence itself. And within this void, I began to see them, souls suspended in isolation, each one contained within what looked like a perfect sphere of crystal that reflected their faces back at them from every angle. "Behold," Jesus said, "hell's worst torture." He guided me closer to one of these spheres, and I could see inside it a man who appeared to be in his 40s. He was not burning. He was not being torn apart by demons. He was simply there, alone, surrounded by reflections of himself that showed not just his physical appearance, but somehow displayed his entire life, every moment, every choice, every opportunity, every consequence. And as I watched, I began to understand the true horror of his situation. This man was experiencing perfect self-knowledge. He was seeing himself exactly as he was, without self-deception, without rationalization, without the comforting lies we tell ourselves to make our failures and cruelties bearable. He was seeing the reality of who he had chosen to become, and he was seeing it with the perfect clarity of eternity. "This is the mirror of truth," Jesus explained, his voice gentle yet unyielding. "Each soul here experiences perfect self-revelation. They see not only what they did, but why they did it. They see not only who they hurt, but how that hurt rippled outward through time, affecting people they never met. They see what they could have been compared to what they chose to become. And they see it all with God's perfect understanding, yet without God's perfect love to make this knowledge bearable." I watched in horror as the man in the sphere curled into himself, trying to escape the reflections that surrounded him, trying to flee from the truth of his own being. But there was nowhere to go, no distraction, no sleep, no moment of forgetfulness. Just eternal, perfect self-knowledge, without the possibility of self-deception. "Lord," I whispered, my voice breaking, This is worse than the fire, worse than any physical torture." "Yes," Jesus said simply. "This is hell's worst torture, to know yourself completely and to have that self be eternally separated from the only one who could love you despite that knowledge." The physical torments you witnessed earlier are the consequences of sin, but this is the essence of damnation itself, to be locked forever in the prison of the self that one has chosen to become. He guided me to another sphere, where I saw a woman who had been beautiful in life, who had built her entire identity around that beauty and the power it gave her over others. Now she was seeing herself as she truly was, not physically but spiritually. She was witnessing every person she had manipulated, every relationship she had exploited, every moment she had chosen her own gratification over genuine love. And she was seeing all of this with perfect clarity, understanding for the first time the emptiness at the core of the identity she had constructed. The worst part, Jesus said, reading my thoughts, is that they now understand exactly what they rejected. They see my love in its fullness. They comprehend the salvation that was offered to them. They recognize the countless opportunities they had to choose differently. And this understanding does not diminish with time, it only grows more acute, more unbearable. We moved from sphere to sphere, and I witnessed soul after soul experiencing this perfect self-revelation. Some had been religious leaders who had used faith to control and exploit others. Some had been ordinary people who had simply chosen, day after day, to harden their hearts against love. Some had committed terrible crimes, while others had lived outwardly respectable lives while inwardly nurturing hatred, bitterness, and selfishness. But all of them were experiencing the same torture, the unendurable yet inescapable knowledge of who they had chosen to become, witnessed with the perfect clarity of eternity, without the mercy of self-deception or the relief of distraction. And then Jesus showed me something that broke me completely. He brought me to a sphere that contained a man who looked surprisingly ordinary, neither particularly evil nor particularly good in his earthly appearance. But as I watched this man experiencing the mirror of truth, I saw something that made my soul cry out in protest. This man had heard the gospel. He had sat in churches. He had known about Jesus. He had even prayed prayers and participated in religious activities, but he had never actually surrendered his life. He had never allowed himself to be transformed by the love he claimed to believe in. He had used religion as a mask, a social identity, a source of comfort, but had kept his deepest self locked away from God's transforming power. And now, he was seeing the truth of his choice. With perfect clarity, he was experiencing the full knowledge of what he had been offered and what he had rejected. He was understanding, too late, the difference between religious performance and genuine surrender. This, Jesus said, his voice filled with a sorrow deeper than I could comprehend, is what I need you to warn them about. This is the truth that will destroy their comfortable assumptions about salvation. Many who call me Lord, Lord will find themselves here, experiencing the perfect self-knowledge that reveals their faith to have been a performance rather than a transformation. I fell to my knees in that place beyond physical reality, overwhelmed by what I was witnessing. The worst torture of hell wasn't the fire or the darkness, or even the separation from God. It was the inescapable, eternal self-knowledge that came with that separation. It was seeing yourself with perfect clarity, without the mercy of self-deception, and recognizing what you had chosen to become and what you had rejected. Please, I begged, my entire being recoiling from this revelation. I can't bear any more. Take me back. Jesus placed his hand on my shoulder, and instantly the abyss and its crystal spheres vanished. We were rising now, moving back through the layers of reality we had descended through. But even as the physical torments of hell's outer regions receded below us, I couldn't escape the memory of what I had witnessed in those spheres, the perfect self-knowledge that constituted hell's worst torture. Why? I managed to ask as we ascended. Why show me this? Why must I carry this knowledge? Because they need to know the truth, Jesus replied, his eyes holding mine with infinite compassion yet absolute resolve. They need to understand what is truly at stake, not just physical torment, but the eternal consequence of who they are choosing to become with each decision they make. As the Garden of Gethsemane materialized around us once more, I knew that what I had witnessed would haunt me for the rest of my life. But I also knew that I had been given this burden for a purpose, to share a truth that would destroy comfortable assumptions and potentially save souls from the worst torture imaginable, the torture of seeing themselves, at last, exactly as they are, without the love of God to make that knowledge bearable. And this was only the beginning of what Jesus showed me about hell's worst torture, a revelation that would grow even more devastating as he explained the mechanics of eternal self-knowledge and why it constitutes a punishment more terrible than anything human imagination has conceived. The ancient olive trees of Gethsemane stood like silent witnesses around us as I collapsed onto the cold ground, my body shaking uncontrollably. Though we had physically returned from hell, the images of those crystal spheres, each containing a soul trapped in the torture of perfect self-knowledge, remained seared into my consciousness, with such clarity that I could still see them when I closed my eyes. Jesus knelt beside me, his presence both comforting and terrifying. How could the same being embody such perfect love and yet allow such perfect justice? The contradiction felt impossible to reconcile after what I had just witnessed. "You have questions," he said. It wasn't a question but a statement of fact. Of course I had questions. How could anyone witness hell's worst torture and not be shattered by questions? "Why?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. "Why is perfect self-knowledge the worst torture? Why not just cease to exist? Wouldn't annihilation be more merciful than what I just saw?" Jesus sat down on a nearby stone, the same garden where he had once prayed so fervently that his sweat became like drops of blood. In the moonlight, his face held an expression of such profound sorrow that it was almost unbearable to witness. "What you're about to learn," he said, "will destroy conventional understanding of both human psychology and divine justice." Are you prepared for that? I wasn't. How could anyone be prepared to have their entire theological framework dismantled? But I nodded anyway, knowing I had no choice but to hear the full truth now that I had witnessed its manifestation. "The souls you saw in those spheres," Jesus began, "are experiencing what philosophers and theologians have only dimly grasped throughout human history, that the self is both heaven and hell. The same capacity that allows humans to experience my presence as paradise also allows them to experience their true selves, apart from me, as torment beyond imagination." He gestured to the night sky above us, where stars glittered like distant diamonds against the blackness. "Your scientists speak of black holes, places where gravity becomes so intense that not even light can escape. What you witnessed in hell is the spiritual equivalent. Each soul becomes a gravity well of self, collapsing inward eternally without the counterbalance of my presence. Without me, the human self implodes, creating a spiritual singularity from which there is no escape." I struggled to comprehend what he was saying. But why is self-knowledge so unbearable? Why is seeing ourselves as we truly are worse than fire or physical torture? "'Cause you were created for truth," Jesus replied, his voice gentle yet unyielding. "Your entire being is designed to align with reality. When you embrace truth about yourself, about others, about me, you experience harmony and peace, even when that truth is difficult. But when you reject truth, you create internal dissonance that becomes increasingly painful the longer it persists and the more comprehensive it becomes." He picked up a small stone from the garden path, turning it over in his hands as he continued. "During earthly life, humans have countless mechanisms to avoid this pain: self-deception, distraction, rationalization, projection of blame onto others. These mechanisms create a buffer between the self you present to the world and even to your own consciousness and the truth of who you have chosen to become through your decisions." He set the stone down with deliberate care. In hell, all these mechanisms are stripped away. The soul experiences perfect self-knowledge without any ability to distort or escape that knowledge. Every motivation is revealed. Every self-justification is exposed as hollow. Every opportunity rejected is seen with perfect clarity, and this happens not as a momentary revelation, but as an eternal state of being. I thought about the souls I had seen in those crystal spheres, each one surrounded by reflections that showed not just their actions, but the true nature and consequences of those actions. The religious man who had used faith as a mask rather than allowing himself to be transformed. The beautiful woman who had built her identity on manipulation and control. The ordinary-seeming man whose life had been a series of small cruelties and rejected opportunities for compassion. But why is this worse than physical torture? I pressed, still struggling to fully comprehend. Why did those souls seem more tormented by self-knowledge than others were by fire or demonic attack? Jesus looked at me with eyes that held the sorrow of centuries. Because physical pain, no matter how intense, remains external to the essential self. The soul can still maintain some separation, some sense that this is happening to me rather than this is me. But the torture of perfect self-knowledge is different. There is no separation between the torment and the self. The torture is not something happening to them, it is them, experiencing the full reality of who they have chosen to become. He stood and walked a few paces away, looking out over Jerusalem glittering in the distance. "Imagine," he said, "the worst shame you have ever felt. The moment when you recognize something truly ugly within yourself, some cruelty, some selfishness, some betrayal that revealed a darkness you didn't want to acknowledge. Remember how you wanted to escape that feeling, how you rushed to distract yourself or rationalize your behavior or blame circumstances." I nodded, uncomfortable memories rising unbidden. "Now imagine that feeling magnified 1,000-fold. Imagine it encompassing not just one action or thought, but your entire being. Imagine experiencing it with perfect clarity, without any ability to look away or distract yourself or diminish its intensity. And imagine it continuing not for a moment or a day or a year, but forever." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the night air. "That," Jesus continued, "is why perfect self-knowledge is hell's worst torture. The soul becomes its own tormentor, its own accuser, its own executioner. No external force needs to apply suffering. The suffering emerges inevitably from the soul's own nature once it is fully revealed to itself without my presence to transform that revelation from condemnation to redemption." He turned back to me, his expression grave. "But there is something even more devastating about this torture, that you need to understand something that will destroy conventional theological assumptions completely." I braced myself, sensing that whatever came next would be even more difficult to hear. "The souls experiencing this perfect self-knowledge," Jesus said, "are not just seeing who they were during earthly life, they are seeing who they are continuing to become throughout eternity." I stared at him, struggling to comprehend what he meant. "Hell is not static," he explained. "Those souls are not simply reviewing a finished life like watching a recording. They are experiencing their ongoing choice to reject love, truth, and redemption, a choice they continue to make with each moment of eternal existence. Their suffering intensifies not because I increase their punishment, but because they continue to choose the very thing that causes their torment." He knelt down beside me again, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "This is the most devastating truth about hell's worst torture, that at any moment these souls could choose differently. They could cry out for mercy. They could surrender the false self they're desperately trying to preserve. They could accept the love they rejected in life. And if they did, I would immediately respond." My mind reeled at the implications. "Are you saying hell isn't eternal? That people can leave?" "I'm saying that the door of hell is locked from the inside," Jesus replied. "What makes hell eternal is not my unwillingness to forgive, but the soul's ongoing choice to reject forgiveness. With each moment, they choose again to cling to the self they have constructed, rather than allow that self to die so that I might give them new life." He gestured toward the crystal spheres that, though no longer visible, remained vivid in my memory. "What you witnessed in those spheres was not just souls experiencing who they had been, but souls actively continuing to become that person more intensely with each eternal moment. Their torture increases not because I will it, but because with each choice to remain separated from me, they move further into the gravity well of self, further into the singularity from which escape becomes increasingly impossible." I struggled to process what he was saying. This understanding of hell contradicted so much of what I had been taught, that hell was a place of divine punishment, that its eternity was fixed and unchangeable, that souls were sent there as a final judgment, rather than choosing to remain there through ongoing rejection. "But why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why would anyone choose to remain in such torment? If they could cry out for mercy at any moment, why wouldn't they?" "For the same reason many refuse mercy during earthly life," Jesus replied. "Pride, the determination to be their own God, the refusal to surrender the self they have constructed, the insistence that they should be accepted on their own terms rather than transformed by love on mine." He picked up another stone, this one jagged and sharp-edged. "Imagine a man who has built his entire identity around being right around, never admitting error, never acknowledging weakness, never surrendering control. During earthly life, he can maintain this false self through power, through manipulation, through surrounding himself with people who reinforce his self-deception. But in eternity, faced with perfect truth, maintaining this false self becomes his torment. Yet surrendering it feels like death, because it is a kind of death. The death of the false self he has invested everything in becoming." He set the jagged stone down next to the smooth one he had placed earlier. "The tragedy is that this death, this surrender of the false self, is exactly what would liberate him. But having refused this surrender countless times during life, he continues to refuse it in eternity, choosing the torment of self-deception over the perceived humiliation of admitting he was wrong. I thought about the souls I had seen, each trapped in their crystal sphere of perfect self-knowledge, each experiencing the unbearable truth of who they had chosen to become. And I realized with horror that Jesus was right. Their expressions showed not just suffering but resistance, a stubborn refusal to surrender even in the face of their own torment. "There's something else you need to understand," Jesus continued, his voice growing even more solemn. "The torture of perfect self-knowledge is not just about seeing your own sin or failure. It's about seeing the fullness of what was offered to you and rejected." He gestured toward the stars again. Each soul in hell doesn't just see who they became, they see who they could have been. They experience perfect knowledge of the transformation that was available to them, the joy they could have known, the love they could have experienced and shared. They see the ripple effects of their rejection, how their choice affected not just themselves but countless others across time. And they see all of this not as theoretical possibility but as concrete reality that they personally rejected. I remembered the ordinary-seeming man in his crystal sphere, the one who had used religion as a social identity while keeping his true self locked away from transformation. His face had shown not just the agony of seeing his hypocrisy, but the unbearable knowledge of what genuine surrender would have created in him, the person he could have become if he had allowed love to transform him rather than using religion to mask his unchanged heart. "This is why religious people often experience hell's worst torture most acutely," Jesus said, reading my thoughts. "They don't just reject me in ignorance, they reject me while claiming to serve me. They don't just miss transformation, they inoculate themselves against it by creating a version of faith that requires no death to self, no surrender of control, no actual obedience to my lordship." He looked toward Jerusalem again, the city where religious leaders had once rejected him while claiming to serve the very God he embodied. "Many who call me Lord, Lord, will experience this torture more intensely than those who rejected me openly. Their self-deception runs deeper. Their false identity is more comprehensive. Their resistance to surrender is more entrenched precisely because they believe themselves already surrendered." A terrible understanding was dawning on me, one that would indeed destroy conventional theological assumptions completely. Hell's worst torture wasn't just about punishment for sin. It was about the natural, inevitable consequence of rejecting transformation while having full knowledge of what that transformation offered. It was about choosing to remain yourself when yourself is exactly the problem that divine love offered to solve. "There's one more thing you need to understand," Jesus said, his voice now barely above a whisper. "Something that will be the most devastating revelation of all." I waited, hardly breathing, sensing that whatever came next would be the most difficult truth yet. "The torture of perfect self-knowledge," he said, "is not something I created as punishment. It is something inherent to being human apart from me. To be made in my image means to be made for truth, for love, for goodness, for beauty. When a soul rejects these things while retaining full awareness of them, torment is not imposed from outside, it emerges inevitably from within." He placed his hand on my shoulder, and in that touch I felt both perfect love and perfect truth, the very combination whose absence constituted hell's worst torture. "I do not send souls to hell," he said with infinite sadness. "I respect their choice to reject me, even knowing what that rejection will mean for them. Hell is not my creation, it is what remains when a soul created for union with me chooses final, definitive separation instead." As the full implications of what he was saying washed over me, I understood why this revelation would destroy conventional understanding. Hell wasn't primarily a place of divine punishment, but of human choice. Its worst torture wasn't inflicted by God, but emerged inevitably from the nature of souls who chose self over surrender, deception over truth, isolation over love. And most devastating of all, this torture was not something that began after death. It was already at work in every human heart that chose self-deception over transformation, that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truth, that used religion as a mask rather than a pathway to genuine surrender. "Tomorrow," Jesus said, rising to his feet, "I will show you the most devastating truth of all, how this torture of perfect self-knowledge begins during earthly life, and how many who consider themselves saved are already experiencing its early stages without recognizing what it portends for their eternity." As his presence began to fade, returning to whatever dimension he had emerged from to guide me on this terrible journey, I remained sitting on the cold ground of Gethsemane, the weight of revelation pressing down on me like a physical burden. Hell's worst torture was not fire or darkness or physical pain. It was the inevitable, natural consequence of a soul experiencing perfect self-knowledge while continuing to reject the only one who could make that knowledge bearable. And this torture was not just a future possibility, it was already beginning in the hearts of everyone who chose self-deception over transformation, religious performance over genuine surrender. The most devastating revelation was yet to come. Dawn broke over Jerusalem, painting the ancient city in shades of gold and amber as I sat motionless on a bench near the Garden of Gethsemane. I hadn't moved since Jesus departed hours earlier. How could I? My mind was still reeling from what he had shown me about hell's worst torture, the perfect self-knowledge that becomes eternal torment for souls who reject divine transformation while retaining full awareness of what they've rejected. Sleep was impossible. Food was unthinkable. I simply sat, watching the city awaken, wondering how many of its inhabitants, how many people worldwide, were already experiencing the early stages of this torture without recognizing the terrible destination toward which it was leading them. The morning air was cool against my face, carrying the scents of dust and stone and distant spices from the old city markets beginning their day. Pilgrims and tourists were starting to arrive at the garden, their excited chatter about walking where Jesus once walked, creating a surreal contrast to what I had experienced in this same place hours before. I moved to a more secluded spot, finding a small stone wall at the garden's edge that offered some privacy. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. My throat felt parched, despite the water I'd been drinking. The weight of revelation and the responsibility of sharing it pressed down on me with such intensity that breathing itself seemed difficult. As the morning progressed into afternoon, I remained in that liminal space between normal reality and the shattering awareness of what I had witnessed. The sun climbed higher, then began its descent toward the western horizon. And as the first hints of evening approached, I sensed his presence returning, not with the overwhelming intensity of the previous night, but gentler, though no less real. He sat beside me on the stone wall, visible now only to me while tourists passed by unaware. In the fading light, his eyes held a sorrow deeper than any human could comprehend, the sorrow of one who sees the full consequence of human choices across time and eternity. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly, "to understand how hell's worst torture begins in this life? To see the signs that many who call themselves mine are already experiencing its early stages?" I wasn't ready. How could anyone be ready to see something so devastating? But I nodded anyway, knowing this revelation needed to be complete if it was to serve its purpose. "Walk with me," Jesus said, standing and gesturing toward the path that led down from the Mount of Olives toward the Kidron Valley. As we walked, the other visitors seemed unaware of his presence, some even passing directly through the space he occupied without noticing anything unusual. "What I am about to show you," he continued as we descended the path, "is happening at this very moment in the hearts and minds of millions who consider themselves saved. The torture of perfect self-knowledge doesn't begin after death. It begins the moment a soul starts choosing self-deception over transformation, religious performance over genuine surrender." We reached the bottom of the path and crossed into the Kidron Valley, where ancient tombs carved into the hillside stood as silent reminders of mortality. Jesus stopped beside one of these tombs, placing his hand on the weathered stone. "The human heart," he said, "is designed for truth to know and be known in perfect transparency. This capacity is what makes heaven possible, as souls experience perfect communion with me and with each other without shame or fear. But this same capacity makes hell inevitable for those who reject transformation while retaining awareness of what they've rejected." He turned to face me directly, his expression grave. "The first sign that someone is already experiencing the early stages of hell's worst torture is this: they must work increasingly hard to maintain their self-deception." Suddenly, without warning, I could see into the hearts and minds of people all over the world, not in a general sense, but with specific, devastating clarity. I saw a pastor preparing his Sunday sermon while actively suppressing the knowledge that he no longer believed much of what he preached. I saw a woman posting religious content on social media while harboring bitterness and hatred toward family members who had hurt her. I saw a man raising his hands in worship while refusing to acknowledge the people he had exploited in his business dealings. "These souls," Jesus explained as I witnessed their inner struggles, "are already experiencing the first stage of the torture you saw in hell. They must expend enormous psychological energy, maintaining the gap between who they present themselves to be and who they are actually choosing to become. With each act of self-deception, maintaining the false self requires more effort, more elaborate rationalizations, more comprehensive compartmentalization. I watched as these people moved through their daily lives, presenting spiritual facades while inwardly struggling against the very truth their hearts were designed to embrace. The cognitive dissonance they experienced wasn't just uncomfortable, it was actively painful, a constant low-grade torment that they attempted to numb through distraction, busyness, substance use, or increasingly rigid religious performance. They believe their discomfort comes from external sources, Jesus said sadly. They blame circumstances, other people, even demonic attack for the unease they feel. But what they're experiencing is the natural consequence of a heart divided against itself, a soul designed for truth that has committed itself to maintaining lies. We continued walking, now passing through a residential area where families were visible through lighted windows, engaged in their evening routines. The second sign, Jesus continued, is increasing isolation of the true self, even amid apparent community. Again, my perception shifted and I could see into the inner experience of people gathered in homes, restaurants, and churches. On the surface, they appeared connected, talking, laughing, sharing meals, participating in religious activities together. But at a deeper level, I could see that many were profoundly alone, their true selves hidden behind carefully constructed personas that they believed were necessary for acceptance. These souls, Jesus explained, are experiencing the second stage of hell's torture. They are creating internal isolation that mirrors the isolation of those crystal spheres you witnessed. They believe they must hide their true thoughts, doubts, struggles, and sins to maintain their standing in their communities. With each passing year, fewer people, often no one at all, knows who they truly are. I watched as these people engaged in conversations where they never said what they actually thought, participated in religious activities while inwardly disconnected, and maintained relationships that never touched their deepest realities. The loneliness they experienced wasn't circumstantial, it was self-created through their ongoing choice to present a false self rather than risk the vulnerability of being truly known. This isolation, Jesus said, is not imposed on them by others. It is constructed by their own choices, their decision that being truly known is more frightening than being truly alone. In eternity, this self-imposed isolation becomes the crystal sphere you witnessed, where the soul is trapped with nothing but reflections of its own true nature that it still refuses to surrender. We had reached the old city now, passing through Damascus Gate into the narrow, winding streets where vendors were closing their shops for the evening. The ancient stones beneath our feet had witnessed centuries of human history, countless lives lived and ended, innumerable choices made that echoed into eternity. The third sign, Jesus said as we walked through a quiet alleyway, is the increasing need for external validation to suppress internal awareness. Once more, my perception shifted, and I could see people engaged in desperate pursuits of validation through social media, through achievement, through accumulating wealth or influence, through religious recognition. But what horrified me was seeing that this pursuit of external validation wasn't just about ego or insecurity. It was a deliberate, if unconscious, strategy to drown out the voice of truth within them. These souls, Jesus explained, are experiencing the third stage of hell's torture. They require an ever-increasing volume of external voices telling them they are right, they are good, they are spiritual, they are saved, because the voice of truth within them is saying something very different. Like addicts needing larger doses to achieve the same effect, they need more and more validation to maintain their self-deception. I watched as people checked their phones compulsively for likes and affirmation, as they maneuvered for recognition in their churches and communities, as they surrounded themselves exclusively with those who reinforced their self-perception while avoiding anyone who might challenge it. The desperation in their pursuit was painful to witness because I could see that no amount of external validation could silence the truth they were trying to escape. In eternity, Jesus said, all external validation is stripped away. The soul is left with only the truth. It has been fleeing the reality of who it has chosen to become and what it has rejected. The torture isn't that I impose this awareness as punishment, it's that I finally respect their choice by withdrawing my merciful limitation of self-knowledge that protected them during earthly life. We had reached the Western Wall Plaza, now quiet in the evening hours, with only a few worshippers remaining at Judaism's holiest site. Jesus paused, looking at the ancient stones with an expression that contained both love for the people who prayed here and sorrow for how often religious devotion became a substitute for genuine transformation. The fourth and most devastating sign, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, is using my name and my word to justify remaining unchanged. This time, when my perception shifted, I saw something that broke my heart completely. I saw people using Scripture itself as a defense against the very transformation Scripture was meant to produce. I saw them wielding verses to justify hatred, to avoid repentance, to maintain systems of self-protection and self-exaltation, all while claiming to be submitted to the authority of God's Word. These souls, Jesus said, his voice heavy with grief, are experiencing the most advanced stage of hell's torture that can manifest in earthly life. They have not only rejected transformation while being aware of its availability, they have weaponized the very invitation to transformation, turning it into a defense of their right to remain unchanged. I watched as people quoted scriptures about grace to avoid confronting their ongoing choice to live in sin, as they used verses about truth to justify unloving behavior, as they claimed promises of blessing while ignoring calls to sacrifice. Most devastating of all, I saw them using their doctrinal correctness as evidence of their spiritual health, even as their hearts grew harder, colder, and more resistant to the very spirit they claimed to believe in. This, Jesus said, is the closest earthly approximation to the torture you witnessed in hell, using the knowledge of me to resist actual relationship with me, using awareness of transformation to defend against experiencing transformation. These souls are not just rejecting what I offer, they are using what I offer as justification for their rejection. He turned to face me directly, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. Now, you understand why religious people often experience hell's worst torture most acutely. Their self-deception runs deeper. Their resistance is more comprehensive. Their false identity is more elaborately constructed and defended. They have not just rejected me. They have created a version of me that demands nothing, transforms nothing, and therefore saves nothing. We stood in silence for several moments, the weight of this revelation settling over me like a physical burden. The signs Jesus had shown me were not rare or exceptional, they were common, everyday experiences for millions who considered themselves saved while actively resisting the very transformation that constituted genuine salvation. What hope is there? I finally managed to ask, my voice breaking. If these are already experiencing the early stages of hell's worst torture, how can they escape it? Jesus' expression softened, compassion now outweighing sorrow in his eyes. The hope, he said, is that unlike those you saw in hell, these souls still live in the realm of choice. The door is not yet locked from the inside. Transformation is still available. But escaping this trajectory requires something many find more frightening than the torture itself. What? I asked. Complete surrender, he replied simply, not partial obedience, not selective submission, not compartmentalized faith, but the full surrender of the false self they have constructed, allowing that self to die so that I might give them new life. He began walking again, leading me through the quiet streets toward the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the traditional site of his crucifixion and resurrection. The way of escape is the way of the cross, he continued as we walked, not just believing that I died on the cross for them, but accepting that they must die with me, die to the false self, the constructed identity, the carefully maintained image they have invested everything in becoming. We reached the ancient church, now closed for the night, its massive doors standing as silent witnesses to the central mystery of Christian faith that life comes through death, that resurrection follows crucifixion, that transformation requires the surrender of what we thought we needed to protect. This is the warning you must share, Jesus said, placing his hand on the weathered door, that hell's worst torture begins in this life, in the very choices that seem to offer protection and control. That religious performance without genuine surrender leads not to salvation but to increasingly painful self-deception. That using my name while resisting my transformation is the most dangerous spiritual state possible. He turned to face me one final time, his expression now urgent, almost pleading. Tell them that the torture of perfect self-knowledge awaits all who choose to maintain their false selves rather than surrendering to transformation. But tell them also that this surrender, though it feels like death, leads to the only life worth having. Tell them that the very thing they fear being fully known is also the doorway to being fully loved. As his presence began to fade, returning to whatever dimension he had emerged from to guide me on this terrible journey, his final words echoed not just in my ears but in the depths of my spirit. The choice is still available, the transformation is still offered, the surrender that seems like death leads to the only life that lasts. But they must choose now, today, while the door can still be opened from either side. And then he was gone, leaving me alone outside the ancient church in the gathering darkness of Jerusalem night. But the weight of his revelation and the urgency of his warning remained, pressing on me with such intensity that I knew I could not rest until I had shared what I had witnessed. Hell's worst torture is not fire or darkness or physical pain. It is the inevitable, natural consequence of a soul experiencing perfect self-knowledge while continuing to reject the only one who could make that knowledge bearable. And this torture doesn't begin after death, it begins now, today, in the very choices that seem to offer protection but actually create the prison from which there will eventually be no escape. The warning has been given, the signs have been revealed, the choice remains available but not indefinitely. What will you choose?